our second presentation of the day from Raye. They are a researcher in the UK interested in medieval and early modern history of Britain, and in particularly on the wildlife and wildflowers from early Britain. They've recently authored a book, The Atlas of Early Modern Wildlife, which maps the wildlife of Britain and Ireland from 1500 to 1750. So this should be a really interesting talk. So over to you, Lee.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many nice names in the chat. Can everyone hear me and can you see the slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. So what I want to talk to you today is about my new atlas. It's going to be coming out in June. This is it here. The Atlas of Early Modern Wildlife is going to be a collection of maps and of descriptions of where wildlife used to live in Britain and Ireland between the 16th and the 18th centuries. If you're interested in getting a copy after watching this talk, then the publisher has sent this wonderful graphic, so you can type in GGR25 on pelagicpublishing.com and you will get you'll be able to get a copy. Most of the stuff I'm going to show you today has not previously been shared, so please don't share any pictures on social media. If you're watching this in June after the book has come out, hi everyone who's watching on the recording, but please don't share until then. Okay, let's get started. So first of all, why did I want to create an atlas of early modern wildlife in the first place? Well, there's really two answers. The first answer to why sort of early modern wildlife is that by looking at the 16th to the 18th centuries, we can get an idea of where wildlife was living before some major disruptions. So this is before the industrial revolutions, before the agricultural revolutions, before the trigger-happy gamekeepers started destroying all of the predators, and before naturalists started collecting eggs, also an important one. This period wasn't a time when nature was pristine. That's kind of a historical myth which is important to debunk. There were things going on in this period, so it was a little ice age. It was much colder, so cold-loving species were having a good time and the heat-loving species were sort of retreating southwards. And there were other things going on which humans were doing, which was affecting local wildlife. But the other reason why this period is ideal for sort of using as a baseline is, first of all, it's quite recent, so we might be able to maybe restore habitats, restore species to this sort of level. But the other thing is the data from this period is actually quite good. So usually with historical data, we have a few problems. Sites can't be identified because this is before the advent of the national grid system, definitely, of course, before GPS systems, before even postcodes were invented. But we do have quite good data because lots of the sources which I found, like this one, this is the ancient and modern state of county and city of Cork. Cork is down here in the south of Ireland in Munster. This gives a chapter at the beginning which explains exactly where every single place name is in comparison to the rest of the county. So we sort of, when we do get these local records, we can sort of identify where they are. Another piece of best practice is this is before Carl Linnaeus systematized the taxonomic nomenclature. Linnaeus didn't invent the binomial system, but he did systematize it. So after Linnaeus, it's much easier to identify species. But the early modern naturalists from the 16th to the 18th centuries were aware of the challenges in identifying species. So they had various ideas for this. They would sometimes give multiple names. So they would attempt to give a sort of a scholarly name and a common name. And sometimes they give multiple scientific and common names to try and rack up multiple ones. So here we've got a binomial name, Perdix cinerea of Aldrovandi, the partridge. We've got a single a uninomial name, Coturnix the quail. And here at the end, we've got multiple names. So Ralus or Otygometra of Aldrovandi. We've got a citation there. And the Crex Aristotelis, obviously the Crex of Aristotle. And then two common names, the landrail or Dagehen. Now, when we have multiple names like this, especially for species which you find again and again, it's we can be pretty competent in identifying them. So this is a record of the corncrake. Unfortunately, it's not very specific, so we have to record it at county level, which I'm sure will have people who map records absolutely gasping in amazement in horror, really, at how clumsy they were with the data back then. But this is the sort of data we have from the period. So we don't get many records. We get lots of county level records. We get a few little site level records, all right, which I've done as dots here. We get lots of uncertain records. Here's an absence record, a local absence record. There are lots of regions which are uncertain, which you can see I've dappled here. That implies that I don't have many records for the area, so we might or might not have species there. So we have to see this as a map of, this is one of the maps I created, we have to see it as a map of where a species has been recorded, not necessarily the entirety of where it was, because the early modern naturalists were not systematic in their approach. They would record animals near them, where they knew about them. But what we can say, this is a map of the corncrake. Here is a hugely simplified modern distribution, just for comparison. And we can say, look, the corncrake was recorded in his Cork and County Waterford. It was recorded down here in Cornwall. Records from Pembrokeshire and from Anglesey. These are places where the corncrake isn't found so often today. Of course, it's gone through the huge reduction in numbers in recent years. The final thing, which a few people do, is we get, with the very biggest books, we sometimes get that early modern naturalists would send out questionnaires before they start writing, and that means that they're really getting sort of peer-sourced data, crowdsourced data. They're getting sort of a citizen science project going on. So this questionnaire would go out to the idle gentry who have nothing to do but to sit on their generational wealth and collect rent. So they like to know sort of their ancestral seats and what was living there. So they would be recording wildlife. It would go out to physicians who liked to treat local diseases with local remedies. So they were already sort of trained in botanical identification, and they could also be stretched to identify wildlife. It would also go out to clerics who were university educated, who were in every part of Britain and Ireland, and who were expected to talk to ordinary people. So they would be talking to the fishers and the fowlers and agriculturalists and farmers and sort of lots of people who lived in the countryside and worked there and knew about the local wildlife. This is different to the sort of data we would get if we looked at the medieval period, where it was very much, now according to Pliny and Aristotle, this is very much, let's look at the book of nature for the first time and identify what's there. So I wanted to go through a few of the records which I've got and just show you what I've been able to find. So here's my records for the wolf, quite excitingly. Most people are pretty confident that the wolf was extinct from most of Britain by the 16th to the 18th centuries. There are some records from Sutherland up here, but it's quite well recorded, the wolf, especially in the west of Ireland. And you can see lots of county level records here, a few local presence records, some local absence records, and you can see that where we reach the edge, so for example, we've got records in County Galway here, no records in County Mayo, but I've dappled it to indicate we don't have any data from that period, from that area. So wolves might or might not be there, but you can sort of, you have to use your imagination to extrapolate from this data where wolves might have been found. It's not just the quantitative level sort of mapping data, which I've included in this atlas. So I've also included some sort of qualitative data. So sort of how was the animal seen? Was it used for meat? Was it used for fur? Was it fished out of the ocean? Did people hate it like the adder and therefore record it even more often? Fantastic. I've also created a section on recognition, and that's because names quite often change over time. So a good example of this is the crane here. In the early modern period, people had no difficulty in identifying crane, but if you talk to an ordinary person today, they might use the term crane to refer to the heron. And that seems to be because as the crane went more and more, became more and more rare, there started to be this confusion and people started to look for a species which they thought could be identified as the crane to fill that cultural gap. So names change over time. Some names are lost, some new names are found. Some names were originally generic and became specific, and some were originally specific and became generic. So I've been able to sort of trace a bit of that here. Now, there are some problems with the Atlas, obviously. I've only been able to find 10,000 records, which is a pittance, obviously, compared to modern recording in Britain and Ireland, where we were expecting to have, hundreds of thousands of records for some species. And that's just in the last 10 years rather than a period of 250 years. I have been able to I have found 200 good sources, which helps. Or over 200 now, actually. So I've been able to sort of reconstruct 150 species. But again, when you're looking at data which is this tentative, it can be difficult. If I look at some other examples here, so this is my records of the salmon. Now, obviously, today we tend to think of the salmon as not really being a species found in the south or the Midlands of England, and the early modern data does sort of bear that out. So we get lots and lots of records from Scotland, lots from the south of Wales down here, and not so many from England. But at the same time, you can see that recorders were still saying that the salmon was present in their local counties, with the exception of a few where I don't have very much data. So lots of people saying it's present in the river, just I'm not going to give you a fishing location because there's no point fishing for it. It's so rare. So they're probably being further decline in the salmon. The same thing with the oyster. So with the oyster, we can see that it seems to have been previously quite widespread. It's sort of recorded on every coastline, and there are lots of local records. Now, of course, the oyster has declined due to sort of overexploitation and the invasive non-native species. So these are records sort of in the further forth here. Some may be on between East Anglia and Lincolnshire, places where we don't tend to find oysters as often nowadays. They were still being recorded in the early modern period. So again, this is sort of giving us baseline data, which might be useful if we were ever going to restore the species. The Scottish wildcat in the early modern period, not looking so Scottish. We've got lots and lots of records from the Lake District, most of these due to a single recorder who especially loved hunting wildcats and pine martens and all sorts of other things, which you really, really wished that he didn't like hunting. But it does give us this fantastic data. We've got records here from Raye, from Pembrokeshire, some records from Northamptonshire. Now, again, I'm not saying that the wildcat, there was a relict population in Northamptonshire and a relict population in Pembrokeshire and sort of no populations in between. The most likely scenario is we just happen to have enough recorders to identify these populations, but it might even have been more widespread, although there are no records from Ireland, no evidence the wildcat was ever found there, at least in the early modern period. Not all species have declined. Some have actually expanded. So we get some really interesting ones. The rabbit, especially interesting from the perspective of someone who's sort of trained in historical methods like me, because there's always been this debate between English archaeologists who say that sort of 200 years after rabbits were introduced in the 11th century, they start to be found inland and more common, and they even start to be wild living. And that's sort of opposed to the research of historians in Scotland and in Wales, who say, no, the rabbit was not found inland until very recently. It's sort of been a modern expansion inland. Previously, it was just found on the coasts and on the islands and sort of on useful warrens and lovely sandy soil. And it seems like both of them were right, actually. The rabbit in the early modern period was found inland in England, especially, as you can see, South England, North England, but not in Wales, not really in southwest England, and only occasionally in Scotland. A few records here from Munster. The roe deer, by the early modern period, was not doing well at all. It had been hunted from most of its previous range. So what I've done here with the records is attempted to distinguish between free living populations of roe deer and populations of roe deer where they were just being kept in local parks. So you can see where I've just got dots outside of shaded areas, those seem to be park populations. But we have wild living populations in Eryri again and in Scotland north of the Central Belt. Elsewhere, the roe deer appears to have been hunted to extinction by the early modern period. Of course, it's now been reintroduced due to restocking for additional hunting. People wanted to hunt it in the 18th and 19th century, so it was introduced, and now, of course, it's found everywhere again. Again, not a species which was recorded in Ireland. Pike is a fascinating one, just because people tend to think that after the last ice age, all of the fishes which were obligate freshwater fishes, which couldn't access the sea, were able to colonize via the land bridge, via Doggerland up here, just before the land was inundated and the ice melted. So usually people will say that the likelihood is that the pike was only found in the east of England, just like all of the freshwater obligate fishes, until it was introduced more widely by anglers in the modern period. But that actually doesn't seem to have been the case. In the early modern period, it was already distributed quite widely. So we have lots of records from Scotland, lots from Ireland. And I think we might have to start going back to the old model, which is usually thought to be a myth of maybe of seabirds with eggs attached somehow to their feet as they fly over. Either that or people were introducing them into ponds and they just escaped into rivers. But certainly the distribution of pike in places like Scotland, even places like the south of Wales and central Wales and Ireland, seems to have been earlier than previously believed.
Just got a couple of minutes left, Lee.
That's all right. I'm just about to finish anyway. If you're interested in what I've talked about, again, GGR 25, that's just for our conference in pelagic-publishing.com. I'll leave you with two records. Here's the two maps, sorry. Here's the Puffin, where we can still see some of the historical sites, some of which have now been destroyed, have been destroyed by the importation of brown rats. And again, the seal. Seal, again, very interesting one, because shortly after 1900, the seal was nearly extinct and had to be protected by law. But in the early modern period, it was quite widespread, just like it is today. Thank you very much, everyone. If you have any questions, I will answer them in the Q&A.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, Lee. There is a couple of questions that have actually come in. Well, one asking if you could say something about pine marten, but I will ask you, just perhaps you could type that into the Q&A. But Sorrel Jones has asked, said fantastic talk, but was there a bias towards certain groups like birds that we have today? And was there a spatial bias in your source of texts, with some areas given more attention than others?
Yes, definitely both. So unfortunately, there's very few records of invertebrates. People have found it hard to see them. Presumably, they weren't using moth trapping, so there's only a few records of where people have really made an effort to identify things like butterflies. Marine invertebrates were more widely recorded, so things like crabs and lobsters, and even things like cuttlefish are much more recorded, strangely, than terrestrial invertebrates, which I suppose were too small to be of interest. Yeah, mostly there is an interest in, first of all, animals which could be exploited, so tasty mammals and birds and fish, and then sort of animals which might be dangerous, or pests, and then everything else at the bottom. In terms of region, yes, there's many, the majority of records actually comes from Scotland. Well, there's about 37% of my records come from Scotland, strangely enough. Ulster is very well recorded. I suppose that Presbyterian sort of plantation means that it's almost an extension of Scotland at this point in time. There's less records from the rest of Ireland, especially Connacht. Wales, southwest England, south of England, very well recorded. North of England, quite well recorded. Midlands, not very well recorded at all. So it has changed a lot, with sort of Midlands being one of the worst recorded areas and Highland Scotland being one of the best. That's very different to today, isn't it? Hopefully that answered the question.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Lee.